In 1944, after the D-Day operations in Normandy, the United States received hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war in camps scattered across 46 American states. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, but the abundance of food provided surprised even the camp administrators. While Germany was facing severe food shortages, the prisoners would discover a food reality that would challenge all their perceptions of the enemy. Hans Müller's laughter echoed through the makeshift mess hall when he saw the aluminum tray in front of him: canned meat, mashed potatoes, soft white bread, and a generous slice of steaming apple pie. "Look at how the enemy wastes food on us," he murmured in German to Otto Schneider, a veteran who kept his chin up even behind barbed wire. But when Hans took the first spoonful into his mouth, his expression changed completely. The silence that followed wasn't mockery, but something much more disturbing: recognition. This is the true story from the Lost War archives about German prisoners who discovered America's real strength through something unexpected: the abundance of a simple meal. What they found would forever change their understanding of who was truly winning the war. The cargo car doors opened with a deafening metallic screech, and the golden October light of 1944 flooded the tired faces of the German prisoners. Hans Müller blinked repeatedly, adjusting his eyes to the brightness after 3 days of almost total darkness since leaving the port of New York. The smell of damp earth and dry leaves from Oklahoma immediately replaced the acrid scent of sweat and fear that had dominated the car during the long journey. His legs trembled as they touched American soil for the first time, and he noticed how the air seemed cleaner, less filled with industrial smoke like the one he knew from war-torn Germany. The sound of military boots marching in formation echoed in the distance, blending with voices in English that still sounded strange to his German ears. Accustomed to the guttural commands of his superiors, Otto Schneider stepped off the car. With the rigid posture he had maintained since his days as a corporal in the Wehrmacht, observing every detail of the field that stretched before them with the eyes of an experienced soldier. The wooden barracks lined up in perfect rows, surrounded by barbed wire that gleamed under the afternoon sun. But there was something unsettling about the almost hospital-like organization of the place. The grass was cut evenly. The structures looked solid and well-maintained, very different from the makeshift prisoner camps he had seen on the Eastern Front. American soldiers walked casually between the installations, their movements contrasting sharply with the military tension that dominated German camps. There was no frantic hurry, no nervousness of those fighting for survival, just a relaxed efficiency that suggested an abundance of resources. Otto furrowed his brow, trying to understand this strange atmosphere that seemed almost civilian amidst the military structure. Sergeant William Thompson emerged from the main kitchen carrying a test tray, steam rising from the hot food and forming small clouds that dissipated into the cool afternoon air. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing muscular forearms marked with small burn scars, signs of years working in military kitchens since the early days of the war. The smell of roasted meat and spices spread around him like a comforting aura, causing some German prisoners to instinctively raise their noses to capture the aroma they hadn't smelled in a long time. Thompson observed the newcomers with genuine curiosity, not with the disdain the Germans expected to find in the eyes of the enemy. There was something almost paternal in his expression when he noticed the evident thinness of some prisoners, the way their uniforms hung loosely on bodies that had clearly known deprivation. For him, feeding people was more than a military duty. It was a matter of basic humanity. Lieutenant James O'Connor approached the group of prisoners with measured steps, his military posture impeccable, but without the intimidating rigidity Hans had learned to associate with officers. His American uniform was clean and well-pressed, his polished insignia gleaming in the sunlight, and there was an almost relaxed quality to his presence that defied German expectations about military discipline. When he began speaking fluent German, explaining the basic rules of the camp, his voice carried an accent that revealed a university education, not the harsh tone of field commanders the prisoners were familiar with. O'Connor occasionally gestured as he spoke, a habit that suggested confidence and control, as if managing a prisoner camp were just another administrative task in his career. His eyes scanned the group, not looking for signs of resistance or escape plans, but evaluating basic needs: who needed medical attention, who seemed more shaken by the capture, who could adapt most quickly to the camp routine. Hans exchanged a skeptical look with Otto when O'Connor casually mentioned the welcome dinner that awaited them in the main mess hall in an hour. The veteran's expression remained impassive, but Hans could see the almost imperceptible tension around his eyes, that instinctive soldier's distrust of any unexpected generosity. The concept of a welcome meal for prisoners of war seemed absurd, almost insulting in its apparent sincerity. In the weeks before their capture, they had survived on rations that mostly consisted of hard black bread and thin potato soup, when anything was available. The idea that the enemy would offer something better than what they had access to in German territory seemed like cruel irony, or perhaps a sophisticated form of psychological humiliation. The enemy's abundance would be our first and most disturbing discovery about the true nature of this war. The camp's mess hall stretched out like an improvised hangar, with long wooden tables arranged in precise rows that could easily accommodate 300 men at once. The plywood walls still emitted the fresh smell of recent construction, mixed with the complex aromas wafting from the adjacent industrial kitchen, a blend of spices, roasted meat fat, and something sweet that Hans couldn't immediately identify. Electric lamps suspended by wires hung from the high ceiling, casting yellow light circles that turned the tables into islands of brightness amidst the vastness of the space. The sound of footsteps echoed differently here, more hollow and resonant, amplified by the functional architecture that prioritized efficiency over comfort. As the German prisoners began to take their seats on the wooden benches, the creak of the wood mingled with low murmurs in German, cautious comments about the surprisingly large size of the place and the obvious abundance of resources necessary to build such a structure. Hans sat next to Otto in the third row, his eyes automatically scanning the details that might reveal clues about their circumstances. The tables were clean in a way that suggested regular maintenance, not just a special preparation for the newcomers, and there was an institutional yet well-maintained quality to the whole environment. Small salt and pepper shakers were distributed at regular intervals, a luxury Hans hadn't seen since before the war, when such condiments had become scarce even for German civilians. The antiseptic smell of industrial detergent was noticeable, beneath the aromas of food, indicating cleaning standards that exceeded anything he had experienced in German military facilities in recent years. His hands, still rough from the past weeks as a prisoner in transit, touched the smooth surface of the table with a strange sensation. It was both comforting and unsettling, as if the care taken to maintain this environment contradicted everything he had learned about the treatment of prisoners of war. Otto maintained his military posture even while sitting, his back straight and eyes alert, but Hans could perceive the way his companion discreetly inspected every detail around him. The veteran had survived the brutal Russian campaign and knew how to recognize signs of abundance or scarcity with the precision of someone who had relied on such knowledge to survive. The expressions of the other German prisoners revealed a similar mix of skepticism and curiosity. Some furrowed their brows in distrust, others seemed genuinely intrigued, but all shared that underlying tension of men who had learned not to trust unexplained generosity. Whispers in German circulated between the tables, speculating on the Americans' motives for such treatment, with theories ranging from psychological propaganda to preparation for more sophisticated interrogations. The atmosphere was charged with nervous anticipation, as if everyone were waiting for the familiar reality of deprivation to reassert itself at any moment. Sergeant Thompson emerged from the kitchen, followed by a team of American soldiers carrying aluminum trays that gleamed under the mess hall lights. The steam rising from the trays created small aromatic clouds that dispersed into the air, carrying scents that immediately made Hans's stomach tighten involuntarily, his body reacting to smells he had forgotten during months of inadequate food. The trays were surprisingly heavy, as Thompson casually demonstrated, while placing one in front of each prisoner with efficient but careful movements. The metallic sound of the trays touching the wooden tables created a steady rhythm that filled the mess hall, occasionally punctuated by subdued exclamations in German when prisoners saw the contents. Thompson moved between the tables with the confidence of someone proud of his work, occasionally making eye contact with the Germans and offering small nods of acknowledgement that confused Hans. There was no arrogance or disdain, just a kind of professional satisfaction. The first sight of the meal prompted an absolute silence that spread across the mess hall like a wave, gradually replacing the nervous murmurs that had dominated the atmosphere moments before. On the tray in front of Hans, a generous portion of canned meat occupied the center, surrounded by creamy mashed potatoes still steaming, green beans that maintained their vibrant color, and a thick slice of white bread that seemed to have been baked that very day. But it was the slice of apple pie, carefully placed in a corner of the tray, that truly broke any remaining composure. Its golden crust and the visible filling through small decorative cuts represented a level of indulgence that transcended mere sustenance. The complex aroma rising from the complete meal was overwhelming to men who had grown accustomed to thin soups and stale bread, carrying hints of cinnamon, herbs, and rich fats that their bodies craved intensely. Hans found himself gripping the edges of the tray more tightly than necessary, as if afraid the generous meal might disappear if he relaxed his vigilance. Faced with that unexpected abundance, our German arrogance began to crack like ice under the sun. Hans lifted the metal fork with fingers that trembled imperceptibly, not from fear, but from an anticipation that deeply embarrassed him. The texture of the mashed potatoes was completely different from anything he had experienced. Creamy and rich, with small lumps of butter that melted on his tongue, releasing a flavor that felt almost decadent in its intensity. The contrast was brutal. While in his last week in German territory, he had shared a raw potato with 2 other soldiers, here he was faced with a portion that could feed 3 hungry men. The canned meat, initially dismissed as inferior, revealed layers of flavor that his malnourished palate could barely process. Salty, but not overly so, with a richness that suggested abundant resources even dedicated to preserving food. The sound of careful chewing filled the mess hall as hundreds of German prisoners simultaneously experienced a meal that exceeded anything available to German civilians for years. Each bite demanded contemplation, not just for pleasure, but because it challenged fundamental assumptions about who truly controlled resources in this war. Otto cut his meat with military precision, but Hans noticed how his companion's movements were slower than usual, more deliberate, as if each bite required careful consideration. The veteran had survived some of the worst moments of the war on the Eastern Front, where soldiers regularly fought over scraps of food that hardly deserved the name, and his expression revealed an internal struggle between professional composure and genuine amazement. When Otto finally bit into the white bread, soft and fresh with a crumb structure that indicated high-quality flour, his jaw paused mid-chew, and his eyes found Hans's across the table. No words were exchanged, but the look that passed between them carried years of shared experience with scarcity, rationing, and the constant gnawing hunger that had become a companion during the last years of the war. The realization that the enemy was feeding them better than their own government had been able to manage for their civilians was a bitter pill that mixed uncomfortably with the sweet flavor of the well-prepared meal. Around them, the atmosphere in the mess hall slowly transformed from cautious suspicion to something more complex and troubling. Some prisoners ate in silence, lost in private contemplation about the implications of the abundance spread across their trays. Others whispered in German, their voices carrying notes of disbelief and grudging admiration that no one wanted to acknowledge openly. Hans observed how some of his fellow prisoners carefully saved portions of the food, an instinct born of months or years of scarcity, while others seemed almost overwhelmed by the richness and quantity, eating slowly as if afraid of making themselves sick after prolonged malnutrition. The sound of silverware against metal trays created a steady rhythm that was punctuated occasionally by subdued exclamations when someone discovered a particularly flavorful bite. The sensory experience was rewriting everything they thought they knew about American military capabilities and priorities, one spoonful at a time. The slice of apple pie remained untouched on most trays during the first 15 minutes, as if the prisoners needed time to process the audacity of being served dessert, alongside a meal already abundant beyond expectation. Hans stared at the golden crust, noting how steam still escaped through small vents cut into the pastry, carrying the scent of cinnamon and baked apples that seemed almost criminally luxurious given the circumstances. When he finally worked up the courage to taste it, the flavor explosion was immediate and overwhelming, sweet but not cloying, with chunks of apple that maintained their texture, all wrapped in a buttery, perfectly baked crust. His eyes involuntarily closed as he chewed, and when he opened them again, he found Lieutenant O'Connor standing nearby, watching the German prisoners' reactions with an expression that mixed curiosity with something that might have been compassion. The officer's presence wasn't intimidating. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding how this simple act of feeding was affecting men who had expected harsh treatment or deliberate deprivation. Sergeant Thompson moved between the tables with a large coffee pot, offering refills in a casual manner that further confused the Germans' expectations about prisoner treatment. The coffee was strong and hot, with a richness that suggested real beans rather than the chicory substitutes that had become common in Germany during wartime rationing. As steam from hundreds of coffee cups mixed with the remaining aromas of cooked food, it created an atmosphere that was almost cozy, despite the institutional setting and the circumstances that had brought everyone together. Hans watched as Thompson exchanged brief nods with some prisoners, occasionally answering questions about the food in broken German, mixed with enthusiastic gestures. The sergeant's pride in his culinary work was evident, and his willingness to engage positively with enemy prisoners challenged preconceptions about American character that had been carefully cultivated by Nazi propaganda. Each interaction, each generous serving, each moment of unexpected kindness was systematically undermining a worldview that had sustained them through years of conflict. With every bite, we discovered we had been fighting not just an enemy, but an entire civilization of abundance that we couldn't comprehend. The silence that descended upon the mess hall after the meal was not merely the quiet satisfaction of well-fed men, but the heavy contemplation of individuals confronting a reality that demolished their carefully maintained assumptions about war and national superiority. Hans pushed his empty tray slightly forward, an unconscious gesture that revealed his reluctance to let go of the evidence of abundance he had just experienced. The overhead lights cast shadows that seemed different now, less harsh and more welcoming, as if the environment itself had shifted in response to changed perceptions. The sound of chairs scraping against the wooden floor created a symphony of small movements as hundreds of prisoners shifted positions, each lost in private thoughts that none were quite ready to share openly. The air was thick with lingering aromas of well-prepared food, mixed with something harder to define, perhaps the scent of prejudices beginning to crumble, or maybe simply the residual steam of hot coffee cooling in hundreds of cups. Otto finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the relative quiet of the hall. "Hans, do you realize what this means?" His words carried the weight of years of military experience, campaigns fought across continents, where logistics and supply lines determined victories more definitively than bravery or tactics. The veteran's hands remained perfectly still on the table, but Hans could see a slight tremor in his shoulders. Not fear, but the kind of existential uncertainty that comes when fundamental beliefs start to unravel. Around them, other German prisoners were having similar whispered conversations, voices carrying notes of confusion, embarrassment, and reluctant wonder. Some stared into their empty coffee cups as if seeking answers. Others gazed around the mess hall with new eyes, seeing not just a prison facility, but evidence of organizational capability and resource abundance that exceeded anything they had witnessed even in Germany's most prosperous pre-war years. Lieutenant O'Connor moved among the tables, not inspecting or monitoring but observing with genuine curiosity the reactions of men who had expected harsh treatment and instead encountered something closer to hospitality. His interactions with individual prisoners were brief but respectful. A nod here, a short exchange there, always maintaining appropriate distance but never displaying the contempt or superiority that Nazi propaganda had taught them to expect from American officers. When he paused near Hans's table, the young German felt compelled to speak, his English halting but determined. "Sir, in Germany, we don't have such food. For a long time." O'Connor's response was simple but profound in its implications. "We believe treating prisoners well reflects who we are, not who you are." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Hans had been taught about warfare, morality, and national character. They suggested a worldview where strength wasn't demonstrated through cruelty, but through the capacity to maintain civilized values, even when dealing with enemies. The gradual realization that was spreading through the German prisoners went beyond simple appreciation for a good meal. They were confronting evidence of a society that could afford to feed its enemies better than their own government had been able to care for its citizens during the final years of the war. The abundance wasn't just in quantity but in quality, preparation, and presentation. Details that required surplus resources, established supply chains, and an infrastructure that remained intact and functional, despite conducting warfare across multiple continents simultaneously. Hans thought about his family back in Germany, rationing small portions of ersatz coffee and celebrating when they could obtain real meat. While here, hundreds of enemy prisoners were being served multiple courses, including dessert, as a matter of routine policy. The implications were staggering. If Americans could afford such generosity toward captured enemies, what did that suggest about their overall war-making capacity, their economic stability, their societal organization? As evening shadows began to lengthen through the windows of the mess hall, Hans found himself studying the faces of his fellow prisoners with new attention. Some appeared almost ashamed, as if recognizing generosity from enemies was somehow a betrayal of their national loyalty. Others seemed deep in contemplation, perhaps reconsidering narratives they had accepted about American weakness, Jewish influence, or racial inferiority that had been central to Nazi ideology. A few looked genuinely troubled, as if realizing they might have been fighting on the wrong side of a conflict much more complex than their leaders had described. Sergeant Thompson continued his rounds, checking that everyone had sufficient food, occasionally refilling coffee cups without being asked, small acts of consideration that accumulated into a powerful demonstration of values in action. Each gesture reinforced a message that was more effective than any propaganda. This was a society that could afford compassion, a nation confident enough in its strength to extend humanity, even to those who had tried to destroy it. In that silent mess hall, we discovered that our defeat had been written not on the battlefields, but in every perfectly cooked potato, every grain of real sugar, every act of unexpected kindness that revealed a civilization we had underestimated. 3 weeks after their arrival at the camp, Hans found himself sitting on his narrow plywood bed, a blank sheet of paper fluttering between his fingers like a candle in the wind. The barracks were silent except for the rhythmic sound of deep breaths from the other prisoners and the occasional creak of the wood adjusting to Oklahoma's night chill. The yellow light from a single lamp hanging in the center of the dormitory created circles of clarity that barely reached his bed in the corner, forcing him to lean forward to see the pale lines of the paper. His hand still carried the faint scent of American soap, another unexpected luxury that the camp regularly provided, along with clean towels and hot water for showers twice a week. The contrast was disturbing. As he wrote to his family in war-torn Germany, he was cleaner, better fed, and more comfortable than he had been in the last 2 years of war. How could he explain such irony without sounding like a traitor or a man who had completely lost his sanity? Otto watched from his nearby bed, his experienced eyes noticing the internal struggle Hans faced as he tried to find the right words. The veteran had tried to write his own letter 3 times, only to crumple the paper and start over, unable to reconcile the reality of his situation with any narrative that would make sense to Germans living under constant bombardment and severe rationing. The daily meals continued to be abundant: breakfast with real eggs, crispy bacon, toasted bread with real butter, and strong coffee that rivaled anything he had tasted in Berlin cafes before the war. Lunches included thick soups, generous sandwiches, fresh fruits when available, and dinner often featured roasted meats, steamed vegetables, and desserts ranging from chocolate pudding to seasonal fruit pies. As a man who had eaten grass during the siege of Stalingrad, Otto understood that this abundance represented something much more significant than simple food. It was evidence of an industrial and organizational capacity that made a German victory not only improbable, but impossible. The tension of writing honestly versus maintaining family morale created a paralysis that left many prisoners staring at blank pages for hours. Hans finally began with safe details about his health and well-being, but found himself involuntarily describing aspects of the daily routine that revealed the unexpected character of his captivity. He casually mentioned that he was gaining weight, that he slept in a real bed with clean sheets, and that there was access to books in an improvised library that the Americans had set up, using donations from local civilians. Each detail was factual, but cumulatively painted a picture that contradicted everything German propaganda had taught about American cruelty and supposed Jewish-controlled brutality toward prisoners. When he described the Sunday recreational activities, soccer games organized by the guards, movie screenings in a makeshift theater, even occasional musical performances by prisoners with talent, the words felt surreal even as he wrote them. How could he explain that enemy soldiers were treating them with more consideration than many German officers had shown to their own men during the final desperate months of the war? The censorship process that the letters underwent before mailing provided another source of anxiety and revelation. Lieutenant O'Connor personally reviewed each letter, not only looking for sensitive military information, but apparently genuinely concerned with maintaining morale among German families who were already suffering under difficult circumstances. Hans had witnessed the officer editing out references that might cause additional worry, descriptions of weight loss during transport, mentions of other prisoners who were struggling emotionally, details about bombing damage they had observed during their journey through American cities. Paradoxically, this censorship seemed designed to protect German families from unnecessary worry, rather than to gather intelligence or spread propaganda. The consideration was disturbing because it challenged assumptions about enemy motivations and methods that had sustained German resistance. If Americans were capable of such thoughtfulness toward the families of men who had tried to kill American soldiers, what did that suggest about other aspects of German understanding of this conflict? As completed letters, when finally sent, carried a subtext that no censor could eliminate, a tone of men who were confused and troubled rather than defiant or angry. Hans's final draft briefly mentioned that the food here is adequate and we are treated according to international law, but the careful word choice couldn't disguise an underlying amazement that bled through, despite his efforts. Otto's letter similarly focused on reassurances about his health and conditions, but avoided entirely any descriptions that might reveal the true extent of the comfort they were experiencing. Other prisoners adopted similar strategies, creating a collective conspiracy of understatement that protected both their families' morale and their own sense of loyalty to Germany. But in quiet moments between meals and activities, when they thought nobody was observing, many prisoners could be seen staring thoughtfully into the distance, processing the implications of a generosity that was reshaping their understanding, not just of America, but of the nature of civilization itself. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. How could a nation they had been taught to despise be demonstrating more genuine concern for their welfare than their own leaders had shown during the final months of German resistance? In our carefully censored letters, we tried to hide not only military information but the shameful truth that we were living better as prisoners than our families were as free citizens. The discovery of the improvised library and the camp's old supply depot marked another devastating blow to the German prisoners' preconceptions about the nature of their American captors. Simple wooden shelves lined the walls, laden with hundreds of books donated by local communities in Oklahoma, novels in German, works of philosophy, scientific texts, and even a few volumes of poetry that had survived the book burnings in Germany itself. The smell of aged paper and ink mixed with the aroma of wood wax which the prisoners applied weekly to the shelves as part of their voluntary maintenance activities. Natural light filtered through tall windows, creating corridors of golden clarity where particles of dust danced like small constellations, while German prisoners moved silently between the shelves like ghostly figures in search of something that could help them understand their transformed world. The soft sound of pages turning occasionally mingled with deep sighs from men confronting ideas that had been banned or distorted by Nazi propaganda during years of systematic indoctrination. Hans spent his first hour in the library simply touching the books, unable to believe that prisoners of war had free access to such an intellectual treasure. His hands, calloused from months of manual labor and combat, delicately handled volumes that included works by Heinrich Heine, Thomas Mann, and other German authors whose writings had been banned or burned by the Nazi regime. The irony was sharp. In enemy territory, he had access to more authentic German literature than he had experienced in his own homeland during the last 6 years. A particularly well-preserved copy of Mann's The Magic Mountain caught his attention. Its yellowed pages, but intact, with careful annotations in the margins made by some previous American reader who had struggled to understand the complexities of German prose. When he opened the book and began to read, the familiar words in his native language took on new meanings, as if the experience of reading them in American captivity had added layers of irony and depth that he had never perceived before. Literature seemed more real here, less contaminated by politics and more connected to the universal human experience that transcended national boundaries. Otto discovered a section dedicated to military history, where American strategy manuals coexisted with German texts on tactics and war theory. The veteran examined these materials with the professional gaze of someone who had lived the realities described academically on the pages, but found himself surprised by the sophistication and depth of the American analyses of warfare. Texts on logistics revealed a systematic understanding of the importance of supply lines, explaining much about the American ability to maintain simultaneous operations in multiple theaters of war. Manuals on military leadership emphasized principles that sharply contrasted with the brutally hierarchical indoctrination that had characterized German military training under Nazism. The annotations from American cadets in the margins revealed a military culture that encouraged intellectual questioning and independent thinking, rather than the blind obedience that had been exalted as the supreme virtue in the Wehrmacht. Otto gradually realized that he was studying not just military tactics, but evidence of a society that produced educated soldiers and thinkers, not just fanatic followers. Sergeant Thompson occasionally visited the library, not as a supervisor, but as a contributor, bringing new books that local communities continued to donate, even knowing they were destined for German prisoners. His presence created awkward but revealing moments, as prisoners tried to express gratitude in broken English for access to materials that nourished their minds, starved for intellectual stimulation. Thompson responded to these thanks with genuine pleasure, explaining in basic German that he himself had been an avid reader before the war and understood the importance of books for maintaining mental health during confinement. These casual conversations revealed aspects of American culture that contradicted Nazi stereotypes about American materialism and supposed lack of cultural sophistication. The fact that rural communities in Oklahoma possessed libraries sufficiently well-stocked to donate hundreds of volumes to enemy prisoners suggested a level of education and literacy that challenged German assumptions about American intellectual development. Each book donation represented an act of generosity that extended beyond mere material provision, to include recognition of the humanity and intellectual needs of men who were technically enemies. The library became a space where intellectual conversations naturally emerged among prisoners with diverse educational backgrounds, creating an atmosphere of learning that contrasted dramatically with the mind-numbing propaganda that had dominated their experiences during the years of war. Discussions about philosophy, history, and literature provided mental stimulation that many hadn't experienced since university days before military service had interrupted their educations. Hans found himself engaged in debates about ethics and morality with former professors, engineers, and professionals who had been swept into military service but retained their intellectual curiosities. These conversations inevitably touched on questions about duty, patriotism, and the nature of civilization that were directly relevant to their current circumstances. The cognitive dissonance of reading. Goethe, while imprisoned by a nation they had been taught to consider culturally inferior, created a mental framework where critical thinking about propaganda and assumptions became not just possible, but inevitable. Books became catalysts for questioning not just immediate circumstances, but fundamental beliefs about national superiority, racial theory, and the justifications for war that had sustained German resistance up to this point. Between the pages of forbidden books in our own homeland, we discovered that our American captors had preserved more of true German culture than our own leaders. The winter of 1945 brought with it not only colder temperatures, but also fragmented news that arrived through whispered conversations between the guards and occasional radio broadcasts that the prisoners were able to pick up during maintenance work near the administrative buildings. Hans watched through the barracks window as the first snow covered the Oklahoma field, each flake falling softly onto a landscape that had become strangely familiar and even comfortable, despite the circumstances of his presence there. The contrast with the latest news they had received from Germany was brutal. Cities in ruins, civilians starving to death, German soldiers being captured in masses as defense lines collapsed systematically before the advancing Allied forces. Their own living conditions remained stable and even slightly improved when heating systems were installed in the barracks and winter rations included thicker soups and regular hot beverages. The irony of the situation had become inescapable. While Nazi Germany was dying in agony, its prisoners in American territory were living with more dignity and comfort than most of the German civilians who remained technically free. Otto had stopped trying to maintain his rigid military posture during meals, allowing himself to finally relax and appreciate not only the quality of the food, but also the conversations that naturally emerged when men weren't constantly worried about their next meal or basic survival. Discussions in the mess hall evolved from cautious complaints and suspicious speculation to genuine debates about politics, philosophy, and the future that awaited them after the war's conclusion. Many prisoners began to openly express their doubts about Nazi ideology and German war aims, creating an atmosphere where critical thinking about propaganda and assumptions became not only acceptable but encouraged. Otto found himself sharing stories about his experiences on the Eastern Front that revealed the brutality and futility of German tactics, contrasting them with the organized efficiency and relative humanity that characterized American management of the prisoner camp. His military experience provided credibility when he analyzed a strategic situation and concluded that German defeat had become inevitable not because of cowardice or betrayal, but because of fundamental misunderstandings about American industrial capacity and societal resilience. Lieutenant O'Connor began to organize informal education classes where prisoners with professional backgrounds could share knowledge and skills with fellow captives, creating a sense of purpose and community that transcended their original military hierarchies. Hans volunteered to teach basic mathematics, discovering a talent for explanation that had been dormant during his years as an infantryman. These teaching responsibilities provided psychological benefits that went beyond simple time-passing activities. They restored a sense of value and contribution that military defeat had temporarily destroyed. The classes also created opportunities for discussions about post-war reconstruction, career possibilities, and the practical aspects of returning to civilian life in a Germany that would inevitably be dramatically different from the nation they had left. O'Connor's willingness to facilitate these activities demonstrated an understanding of human psychology that impressed even skeptical prisoners who had initially assumed American generosity was merely sophisticated propaganda designed to extract information or cooperation. The gradual acceptance of the reality of German defeat coincided with growing appreciation for American values that had been demonstrated through daily interactions rather than speeches or propaganda. Hans realized that his understanding of democracy, individual rights, and civilian control over the military had been fundamentally shaped by witnessing these principles in action, rather than through theoretical discussions. Sergeant Thompson's respectful treatment of prisoners, O'Connor's administrative fairness, and the general absence of vindictive behavior among American personnel provided practical lessons about civilization that were more convincing than any political argument, as the quality of life in the camp wasn't just adequate. In many ways, it exceeded what educated German professionals had experienced during the final years of Nazi rule, when shortages, fear, and increasing desperation had made normal civilian life nearly impossible. This realization forced uncomfortable questions about the nature of government, the responsibilities of leadership to citizens, and the true costs of militaristic nationalism that had dominated German political culture long before Hitler's rise to power. When news of Hitler's suicide and Germany's unconditional surrender finally reached the camp through official channels in May 1945, the reaction among prisoners was predominantly relief rather than grief or anger. Hans sat in silence during the announcement, processing the end of an era that had defined his entire adult life, but feeling surprisingly prepared for whatever came next. As months of reflection, reading, and exposure to alternative values had created a psychological framework that made the transition to post-war reality seem manageable rather than traumatic. Many prisoners privately expressed their intention to emigrate to America or other allied nations, rather than return to a Germany that would need decades to recover from the devastation that Nazi leadership had brought upon the German people. The camp experience had revealed possibilities for human society that transcended nationalism and racial ideology, offering hope that reconstruction might create something better than what had existed before the war's destruction. As they prepared for eventual repatriation or resettlement, these former German soldiers carried with them lessons about civilization, humanity, and the power of generosity that would influence their choices during the long process of building a peaceful future. From the ruins of their militaristic past, when the war finally ended, we realized that our true liberation had begun not on the day of Germany's surrender, but with the first American meal that taught us the true meaning of civilization.